My fiancé booked a solo vacation during the week we were supposed to choose our wedding venue. I helped carry her suitcase to the car. She came home to discover the future she delayed had already moved forward. My fiancé's suitcase was heavier than it looked, and I remember thinking that before I thought almost anything else that morning. That for a 5-day trip, Sydney had packed like she wasn't planning on missing anything back home. We were supposed to be at the historic warehouse on Camden Road by 10, walking the floor with the venue coordinator, deciding between exposed brick and a tent option for the back lot. Instead, I was standing in the parking lot of our apartment building in Noda, in gym shorts and a shirt I hadn't planned on wearing outside, lifting a suitcase into the trunk of an Uber while Sydney checked her phone for the driver's plate number. "You really don't have to do this," she said, not looking up. "I know. I just mean, you could have slept in." I wasn't sleeping anyway. That part was true. I'd been awake since 5, lying next to her in the dark, listening to her breathe, evenly like someone who had already made peace with a decision I was still trying to understand. 3 days earlier, she'd told me about the trip, Tulum, 5 nights. A girls' trip that wasn't really a girls' trip since it was just her and her coworker Brooke. And she'd told me the way people tell you something they've already decided, not something they're asking permission for. "The Ramirez file finally cleared review," she'd said, like that explained anything. "I need 5 days where nobody needs anything from me." I hadn't argued. I want to be clear about that, because for a long time afterward I convinced myself I should have. But arguing had never gotten us anywhere except further from each other, and I'd learned that the fastest way to lose an argument with Sydney was to have one. So instead, I helped her pick out sunscreen at the Target on South Boulevard, and I didn't say the words venue tours even once, because I didn't want to be the guy who made her trip about me. The driver popped the trunk. I hauled the suitcase up and in, and it caught on the lip of the trunk floor, and I had to shove it the last few inches with my knee. "What do you even have in here?" I said, half a joke. "Just stuff." She was already climbing into the back seat. "I'll call you when I land." "Yeah." She looked at me then, for one full second, in a way she hadn't looked at me in weeks, like she was trying to memorize something or apologize for something she hadn't said yet. Then Brooke leaned across the seat and said something about the driver being early, and Sydney turned toward her, and the door closed, and the car pulled out of the lot and turned left onto 36th Street, and that was that. I stood there for a minute in the empty parking spot where the car had been. Then I went upstairs, made coffee I didn't drink, and looked at the folder on the kitchen counter. The blue one, 3 tabs, one for each venue we'd narrowed it down to. The Camden Road warehouse. The Rosewood barn out past Waxhaw. The garden venue near Davidson that Sydney's mother liked more than either of us did. I hadn't planned on going alone. I want that on the record too, if only to myself. I had planned on waiting. If you enjoy real stories like this, subscribe, because what happened next changed everything for me. 6 months earlier, none of this would have seemed possible. We'd been the couple other people pointed to, not because we were flashy, we weren't, but because we were steady in a way that seemed to reassure people. Sydney was an architect at a mid-sized firm in South End, the kind of job where she came home smelling like plotter ink and complained about clients who wanted open concept, without understanding what a load-bearing wall was. I brokered freight out of an office 2 exits down 77, moving reefer loads and dry van freight for a regional carrier network, the kind of job nobody, at a dinner party, asked a second question about. We'd met at a mutual friend's crawfish boil in Plaza Midwood, both of us standing near the cooler because neither of us liked crawfish and neither of us wanted to admit it. She'd asked me what I did, and when I told her, she said, "So you're basically air traffic control for trucks." And I'd laughed harder than the joke deserved because nobody had ever put it that simply before. For 2 years it worked the way good things are supposed to work, not without friction, but with the kind of friction that sanded things smoother instead of wearing them down. She taught me to like foods I'd have avoided on my own. I taught her that not every silence needed to be filled with a plan. We got engaged on a Tuesday, which she liked better than a big production, at the kitchen counter of the apartment we'd just started sharing, with a ring I'd been carrying around in my jacket pocket for 3 weeks waiting for a moment that never announced itself, so I made one. The cracks, when I look back at them honestly, started small enough that neither of us thought to name them. Sydney's firm promoted her onto a hospital renovation project that ate her evenings. My company restructured territories, and I picked up 2 new carrier accounts that meant more calls at 6 a.m. and more calls at 9 p.m. We started scheduling time together instead of just having it. Dinner became something we put on a shared calendar with a 15-minute buffer in case either of us ran late. The wedding planning was supposed to be the thing we did together, the project that was ours instead of our employers. Instead, it became one more item competing for the same shrinking hours. We picked a date 14 months out. We picked a caterer in a single conversation because neither of us had strong opinions about food we weren't going to taste that night. But the venue turned into the one decision neither of us could make quickly because it was the one decision that felt like it meant something. I wanted the warehouse. Something about the brick, the way the light came in through the old freight doors in the afternoon, felt like it fit us. Not fancy, but honest. Sydney wanted more time. Not the barn, not the garden, not the warehouse. Time. Every time we scheduled a final walkthrough, something came up, a client deadline, a review meeting, a headache that wasn't really about her head. We don't have to decide this week, she said, the third time she pushed a walkthrough. We were standing in the kitchen, and I was holding the blue folder like it might convince her by proximity. We keep saying that. I'm not trying to avoid it. I didn't say you were. She looked at me the way she looked at contractors who'd measured something wrong. You didn't have to say it. That was the first real crack, if I'm being honest about where to put it. Not the fight. We didn't fight. Not really. Not in the way people fight in movies. We just stood in the kitchen not looking at each other for a while. And then she went to bed early, and I stayed up finishing a load confirmation email I didn't need to finish that night. The Tulum trip came up 2 weeks after that. And I understood it, or told myself I understood it. Sydney had grown up in a house where her mother managed every emotional temperature change like a thermostat. And Sydney had learned early that the only way to protect herself from being managed was to disappear a little when things got tight. I'd seen her do it before, in smaller ways. A long run instead of a conversation. A weekend catching up on sleep that was really just distance with a socially acceptable name. What I hadn't seen before was her doing it during the 1 week we'd already promised to each other. I didn't say any of that to her. I said, sounds like you need it, and meant part of it, and buried the other part somewhere I thought I could leave it. The morning after her flight landed, I got a text. Made it. Brooke already ordered a margarita at 10 a.m. LOL. No mention of the venues. No mention of the folder. I typed back glad you're there, and put the phone face down on the counter, and then I picked the folder up off the counter again. And I don't know exactly when the decision formed. Only that by the time I had my shoes on, I'd already made it. I drove to the warehouse on Camden Road alone. The coordinator, a woman named Renata who'd clearly done this walkthrough 100 times, met me at the loading dock entrance with a clipboard and the kind of patience reserved for confused customers. Is your fiancée joining us? She's out of town this week, I said. I figured I'd come look anyway. Take some pictures for her. Renata nodded, like she'd heard some version of that sentence before and knew better than to comment on it. She walked me through the space, and I stood where the arch would go, and I looked up at the old skylights that let afternoon sun fall in long yellow rectangles across the concrete floor, and something in my chest did something I wasn't prepared for. It wasn't excitement exactly. It was closer to relief. The feeling of a decision finally landing somewhere solid after months of circling. We can hold this date for you, Renata said, when we finished the walkthrough. 14 months out, but dates like this one go quickly once people start touring in the fall. I didn't call Sydney first. That's the part I've turned over more than any other part of that week, in the months since. I stood in that warehouse with the folder under my arm and a hold deposit form in my hand, and I signed it. $500, refundable, just a hold. That's what I told myself. Just a hold, not a decision, not really. Except I knew, standing there, that it was a decision. I'd made it for both of us, in her absence, because for the first time in months I'd wanted something enough to stop waiting for her to want it too. I didn't tell her that week. I told myself I'd tell her when she got back, in person, not over a text she'd read poolside between margaritas. So for 5 days I went to work. I answered her check-in text with the right amount of warmth, and I carried a secret that felt less like a betrayal and more like the first thing I'd decided entirely on my own in longer than I could remember. She came home on a Sunday. I picked her up at Charlotte Douglas, and she looked tanned and loose in a way I hadn't seen in months. And for about an hour, in the car, over the takeout we picked up on the way home, it felt like something in her had actually rested. Then she saw the folder on the counter. Not hidden. I hadn't hidden it, whatever that says about intention, just sitting where it always sat, except now there was a new page clipped inside the warehouse tab. A confirmation printout. A held date. She picked it up before I could say anything, and I watched her read it twice. You went without me. I did. You booked it without me. It's a hold. $500, refundable. I wanted That's not what I asked. Her voice wasn't loud. It never was. Not really, not even now. I asked if you went without me. You weren't here, Sid. I was gone for 5 days. I know exactly how many days you were gone. I heard the edge in my own voice and didn't try to smooth it. I've known the exact number of days for months. Actually, every time we scheduled something and you found a reason to move it. She set the folder down carefully, the way she set down things she didn't trust herself not to throw. So this was punishment. It wasn't punishment. It was the opposite of punishment. It was me finally deciding something instead of standing in a kitchen holding a folder for the 40th time waiting for you to be ready. I have a job that consumes my whole brain right now. I have a mother who calls me twice a day about flower arrangements for a wedding that's over a year away, and you're telling me you couldn't wait 1 more week. I waited 4 months. The apartment got very quiet after that. Not an angry quiet, a tired one. Sydney sat down on the arm of the couch, still in her travel clothes, and looked at the folder like it belonged to someone else's life. You made a decision about our wedding while I was in another country, she said finally, quieter now. Do you understand how that sounds? I understand how it sounds. I also understand what it felt like to be here, doing this alone, for the first time in a long time, and it felt like something instead of nothing. She didn't answer that. She went and unpacked the suitcase instead, the same green suitcase I'd hauled into the trunk 5 days earlier. And I stood in the kitchen holding a mug of coffee I hadn't touched, listening to her fold shirts in the next room, and neither of us said anything else that night that mattered. We didn't break up that week. I want to be honest about that, because it would be easier to say the story turned on a single moment, and it didn't. What happened instead was slower and less dramatic, the kind of ending that doesn't have a scene attached to it, just a long accumulation of smaller ones. We kept the hold on the warehouse for another month, mostly out of inertia. Sydney's mother called to ask about final decisions, and Sydney would say, "We're still deciding," in a tone that made it clear the deciding had actually already happened without her. At work, things weren't easier. My company had opened up a senior broker position, more accounts, a better split, the kind of role that would have meant something real for us financially, for the wedding, for everything we kept saying we were building toward. I'd been angling for it quietly for a year, picking up the accounts nobody wanted, staying late to make sure a reefer load didn't sit on a dock past its window. My manager, a woman named Marguerite Doyle who'd run logistics for 2 decades and didn't hand out compliments casually, had told me more than once that I had the instincts for it. I didn't get it. They gave it to Preston Vale instead, a guy 2 years younger than me who golfed with the regional VP and who'd lost an account the month before that I'd had to quietly patch relationships on behind the scenes. I found out in a Tuesday morning meeting, the kind of announcement made in passing, like it wasn't going to change anything for the people who didn't get it. I didn't tell Sydney right away. I sat in my car in the parking garage for 20 minutes before I could make myself drive home. And when I did tell her, over dinner, she said the right things. "That's not fair. You deserve that." But I could hear, underneath it, that some part of her had already filed it away as one more piece of evidence for an argument she hadn't made out loud yet. That maybe I wasn't going to be the kind of provider the plan required. That maybe waiting for me to catch up to some version of stability was going to take longer than she had patience for. I didn't blame her for that thought, even though she never said it directly. I'd have thought it too. The actual ending, when it came, happened on an ordinary Thursday in March, 9 months after Tulum, in the kitchen where most of the important things between us had always happened. We'd stopped talking about the warehouse months earlier. The hold had lapsed on its own, the $500 quietly forfeited, neither of us bringing it up because bringing it up meant admitting the date had passed and nobody had renewed it. Sydney had picked up more hours on the hospital project. I'd started studying for my CTB certification in the evenings. Alone in the second bedroom, we still called the office even though neither of us used it for much besides storing things we didn't want to look at. I don't think I can keep doing the version of this where we're both just surviving until things get easier, Sydney said. She was standing by the sink, not looking at me, the way she'd learned to say hard things without having to watch my face while she said them. I keep waiting to feel like myself again in this relationship, and I don't. I feel like I'm managing a project with you instead of being with you. That's not fair. Maybe not. But it's true. She turned around then. Her eyes were dry, which somehow made it worse. I don't think this is about the venue anymore, Colton. I think the venue was just the first thing that showed me we wanted different speeds. You wanted to move. I wanted room to breathe. And neither one of us was willing to just say that instead of finding smaller things to fight about. I didn't argue. That's the part that surprised me most. even as it was happening. How much of me had already been expecting this? How little fight I had left in reserve. I signed that hold because I wanted something to be certain, I said. Not because I wanted to punish you. I know. She almost smiled, the kind of smile that costs something. That's what makes it sadder. You weren't trying to hurt me. You were just trying to finally have something be settled. And I couldn't give you that. I don't know if I can give anyone that right now. The ring came off 2 days later. Not thrown, not dramatic. She set it on the kitchen counter, on top of the blue folder, which was still there, still holding 3 venues we'd never chosen between. I watched her carry the green suitcase down to her car by herself this time, and I didn't offer to help, and she didn't ask me to. The apartment felt enormous for the first few weeks. I kept the coffee maker running longer than I needed to hear something besides the refrigerator hum. I found myself leaving the television on while I cooked, not because I was watching it, but because the silence had a shape now that it hadn't had before. Marguerite pulled me into her office about 6 weeks after Sydney moved out, ostensibly to review a carrier contract renewal, though I think she'd noticed something in how I was showing up to work. Early, quiet, staying later than the job required. You passed your CTB exam, she said. It wasn't a question. She'd seen the certificate come through HR. Last month. You planning on doing anything with it? Or just collecting letters after your name? I didn't have a good answer for that, so I told her the truth. I don't know yet. Vale's been dropping the ball on the Meridian account, she said, like she was talking about the weather. Clients threatening to move their volume to a competitor. It's not a big account, but it's not nothing either. I need someone who actually returns calls before 6 p.m. to take a run at saving it. She looked at me over her glasses. You interested, or are you still feeling sorry for yourself? I took the account. It wasn't glamorous, a mid-size produce distributor out of Concord who needed reliable reefer capacity during a summer where every carrier in the Southeast was short on trucks. But I worked it the way I used to work things before I'd let myself get distracted by everything else. I called the client's ops manager directly instead of routing through Vale's assistant. I found 2 owner-operators who'd fallen off the radar during the restructuring and brought them back into rotation. 6 weeks in, the client renewed for another year, at a better rate than they'd had before, and told Marguerite directly that they wanted me on their account going forward. It wasn't the kind of win that changes a life, but it was the first thing in almost a year that had gone the way I wanted it to go, entirely because of something I'd done, and I noticed how different that felt from the warehouse hold. Not a decision made to force certainty into existence, but a result that had simply followed from doing the work in front of me. There was a setback that fall, the kind the Bible would call necessary, proof the growth wasn't a straight line. A carrier I'd vetted personally missed a delivery window on a temperature-sensitive load, and the client blamed me directly, in an email copied to 3 people above my pay grade, for not catching the carrier's spotty on-time record. It wasn't entirely my fault. The carrier had falsified some of their compliance paperwork, but it didn't matter in the moment. I spent 2 days feeling like the last year of effort had evaporated, like I was back to being the guy who got passed over. Except now I'd also apparently lost an account I'd fought to save. Marguerite didn't comfort me, exactly. You made a mistake trusting a carrier's paper over your gut, she said. Next time trust your gut. That's the whole lesson. Don't turn it into more than that. I didn't turn it into more than that, or I tried not to. I fixed the vetting process I used going forward, added a step where I called a carrier's last 3 clients directly instead of trusting the compliance file. And within 2 months, the same client that had complained about me was back to routing loads through my desk exclusively. By the following spring, a year after the ring came off, I had my own book of accounts, a small one, but mine. I'd moved out of the Noto apartment into a smaller place in South End, closer to the office, with a lease in only my name for the first time since college. I ran on the rail trail most mornings before work, not for any particular reason except that it gave the day a shape before other people's problems started filling it. I didn't think about the wedding venues much anymore, though every so often I drive past the warehouse on Camden Road and feel something that wasn't quite grief and wasn't quite nostalgia, just the quiet recognition of a version of my life that had almost happened. I heard about Sydney occasionally, the way you hear about people you used to build a life around. She'd left the hospital project, taken a position at a smaller firm doing residential work, the kind of projects she used to say she'd get to eventually once she'd proven herself on something bigger. Mutual friends mentioned she seemed lighter. I didn't ask for more than that, and nobody offered it. The reunion, when it came, wasn't at a wedding, which felt almost too neat a coincidence to hope for, and so it didn't happen that way. It happened at a charity gala for the Second Harvest Food Bank of Metrolina, an event my company sponsored a table at every year, one I usually skipped in favor of sending Marguerite, and whichever junior broker needed the networking more than I did. That year, for reasons I couldn't fully explain even to myself, I decided to go. It was a Saturday in late October, at a hotel ballroom uptown, the kind of event with a silent auction table and a band that played covers just slow enough for people over 50 to dance to. I was standing near the bar with a glass of something I wasn't really drinking, half listening to a conversation about a client's rate dispute, when I saw her across the room. Sydney was wearing green, a color I didn't remember her owning, standing next to a man I didn't recognize who had his hand resting lightly at the small of her back in the unmistakable way of someone still new enough to a relationship to want people to notice the gesture. She hadn't seen me yet. I had a full 3 or 4 seconds to decide whether to look away, and I didn't. She caught my eye a moment later, and something crossed her face that wasn't shock, exactly, more like recognition arriving a beat behind itself. She said something to the man beside her, and he nodded, and she crossed the room alone. "Colton." "Hi, Sid." We stood there for a second in the particular awkwardness of two people who used to know everything about each other's days and now knew nothing. "You look good," she said finally. "Different. Good different." "You too." I meant it. Whatever had settled in her over the past 2 years, it suited her. "I heard you made senior broker," she said. "Marguerite mentioned it to my dad at some Rotary thing, of all places." Small city, I agreed. "I heard you left the hospital project." "About a year ago. I'm doing residential now. Smaller stuff. Turns out I like it better than the stuff I thought I was supposed to want." We talked for a while longer, careful and a little formal, the way you talk to someone you used to fight with in a kitchen at midnight. Both of us skating past anything that might crack the surface we were keeping smooth for a public room. She mentioned the man across the room, Grant, an ER physician she'd met through a friend, and said it lightly, without performing happiness she didn't feel, which somehow made it easier to hear than if she'd oversold it. "I never renewed the hold," I said, before I could decide not to. "On the warehouse. I want you to know that." I thought about it. I didn't. She was quiet for a second. "I know. Renata told my mom. Actually, back when my mom was still calling venues trying to get information out of habit. It expired that spring. I think about that week sometimes," I said. Not in a way that means anything anymore. Just, I think about it." "Me too." She looked down at her glass. "I wasn't running from the wedding, Colton. Not really. I was running from feeling managed. And you weren't trying to manage me. You were just trying to be certain about something, and I couldn't give you certain, not then. I don't know if it was ever really about the venue at all." "I know that now," I said. "Took me embarrassingly long to figure it out. You and me both." The band started something slower. Across the room, Grant glanced our way, not suspicious, just checking in the way people do with someone they care about. Sydney noticed him noticing and gave a small nod that meant "I'm fine, one more minute." "I'm glad you're doing well," she said, and there was nothing performative in it. "I mean that. I used to worry I broke something in you that wouldn't come back. You didn't break anything. You just stopped being able to fix something that was already broken before you got there. That part wasn't your job." She almost laughed, the sound catching somewhere between amusement and something sadder. "That's a very healed-sounding sentence, Colton Marsh. Give it time. I practiced it in the car." That got an actual laugh out of her, quiet, real, and for a second it felt like something between us had finally been allowed to close gently instead of being forced shut. "I should get back," she said. "It was really good to see you." "You too, Sid." She didn't hug me, and I didn't expect her to. She touched my arm once, briefly, the way you touch something to confirm it's solid, and then she walked back across the room toward Grant, and he said something to her I couldn't hear, and she laughed again, easier this time. At home in it in a way she'd never quite managed to be at home in the future we'd tried to build in a Noda kitchen with a blue folder and 3 venues neither of us could agree on. I left the gala a little after 10, before the dancing really got going, and drove home with the windows cracked despite the October chill, because I wanted to feel the air moving instead of sitting still in it. I passed the warehouse on Camden Road on the way, out of habit more than intention. It wasn't really on the way, not directly, but some part of me had steered there anyway. The building was dark, closed for the night, string lights off. The loading dock where Renata had once walked me through empty. I didn't stop. I didn't need to anymore. Back at my apartment, I found the blue folder in a box in the hall closet, the one marked miscellaneous that I'd never fully unpacked after the move. more out of avoidance than necessity. I sat on the floor and went through it. The warehouse brochure, the barn photos, the garden venue Sydney's mother had liked, the lapsed hold confirmation with Renata's signature still on it. None of it hurt the way I'd braced for it to hurt. It felt instead like reading a letter from someone I used to be, someone who'd needed the folder to mean more than it ever could have, because he hadn't yet learned that certainty isn't something you can force into a relationship by signing a form while the other person is somewhere else trying to breathe. I put the folder back in the box. I didn't throw it away. Some things you keep not because you need them, but because they mark the place where you used to stand. Then I turned off the light and let the apartment go quiet around me. The good kind of quiet now, the kind that didn't need filling with anything at all.